In May 2025, the world was shaken. A war that had raged for generations, a conflict soaked in blood and sorrow, suddenly paused. Not because of Washington, not because of the United Nations, but because of a 37-year-old African soldier who carried no empire, no crown, only the moral weight of his people. Captain Traoré of Burkina Faso did the unthinkable. He called upon Israel and Palestine to end their killing, to sit face-to-face in Amman, Jordan, and to sign a ceasefire that has already lasted 4 long months, the longest breath of peace the region has seen in more than a decade. This was not charity. This was not theater. This was Africa stepping into history and demanding to be heard. A voice from the continent long ignored, now speaking with such power that the world had no choice but to listen. And as you watch this story unfold, you will see why Western powers are unsettled, why the streets of Africa erupted in celebration, and why Captain Traoré is now being called Africa's Mandela. Subscribe to African Life TV and stay with us, because this is the story that proves Africa can heal the world. On the 15th of May 2025, a voice rose from Ouagadougou that the world could not ignore. In a press hall not lined with marble or gold, but with the dust and determination of West Africa, Captain Traoré declared something that sounded to diplomats like madness, but to the people of Africa like destiny. He said, "The Middle East has burned for generations. The great powers have failed. It is time for Africa to show the world what true leadership looks like." And with that single declaration, the impossible mission was born. The world reacted with disbelief. In Washington, the State Department released a warning about unauthorized interventions. In Paris and London, officials scoffed, labeling it naive posturing from a small African nation. In Brussels, whispers spread through the European Union chambers, doubting whether Africa had the capacity for diplomacy on such a scale. In Tel Aviv, the Israeli Foreign Ministry dismissed it outright. But in Ramallah, the Palestinian Authority offered cautious welcome, saying, "If the world's strongest cannot deliver peace, perhaps we should listen to those who understand suffering." This was the paradox. For centuries, Africa had been told it was too weak, too divided, too poor to lead. Yet here stood a young soldier carrying the memory of villages burned by terrorism, the grief of mothers who buried sons, the scars of a land scarred by colonial exploitation. And he dared to claim Africa's wisdom could resolve what empires had failed to settle. But behind the boldness, there was strategy. Intelligence reports later revealed that Traoré had not spoken carelessly. He had calculated every step. He knew Africa held unique moral authority because the continent had not invaded the Middle East, had not drawn the colonial borders that deepened its wounds, had not sent drones or tanks across its deserts. Africa carried no imperial baggage. He knew his own credibility mattered. As a commander in the Sahel, he had fought extremists with his own hands, seen the cost of terrorism, and yet refused to let bitterness harden his heart. That gave him a voice both Israelis and Palestinians could trust. He also knew he would not stand alone. Russia and China, eager to counterbalance Western influence, offered diplomatic cover. And Africa's gold, uranium, and resources gave him leverage, enough to ensure the world could not simply dismiss his words. Still, critics laughed. They called it theater. They said, "What can Burkina Faso teach the world about peace?" But Traoré understood something the powerful had forgotten, that true authority is not measured by the size of your army or the weight of your treasury, but by the depth of your moral conviction. From that day forward, the countdown began. Behind closed doors, he reached out to Amman, Jordan, securing a venue where both Israelis and Palestinians could come without the shadow of Washington or Brussels watching overhead. He pressed the African Union to stand as a neutral guarantor. He demanded that no preconditions choke the talks before they began. Step by step, what had seemed impossible began to take form. In the streets of Ouagadougou, his words ignited fire. Students painted murals of Africa rising as Peacemaker. Elders shook their heads in disbelief, then nodded slowly, whispering, "Perhaps it is time." In Europe and America, analysts mocked on television panels, but behind their laughter was unease. If Africa could succeed where they had failed, their authority would crumble. And in the refugee camps of Gaza, in the quiet towns of Israel living under the fear of rockets, whispers spread, maybe this soldier from Africa carries something different. Maybe he sees our pain. It was the impossible mission, a mission too bold to succeed, too outrageous to be believed. And yet day by day it gathered momentum. On the 29th of May, only 2 weeks after his declaration, delegations from both Israel and Palestine, against all odds, agreed to attend preliminary talks in Amman. The condition was simple but revolutionary: no Western mediator at the table, only Africa standing as neutral ground. The impossible had begun to look possible. The stone the builders rejected was becoming the cornerstone of a new peace. But brothers and sisters, every time a light is lit, darkness gathers to snuff it out. And as Captain Traoré prepared to walk into those talks, forces far more powerful than rockets or tanks were already moving to destroy him. Amman, Jordan, a city ancient and restless, perched between desert winds and the weight of history. It was here, behind barricades of soldiers and layers of suspicion, that the impossible unfolded. On the 29th of May 2025, representatives of Israel and Palestine walked through the same doors, sat under the same roof, and faced each other without the heavy shadow of Washington, Brussels, or London at their backs. And presiding over them was not a general from the Pentagon, not a diplomat from Paris, but a 37-year-old African soldier named Traoré. His method was unlike anything the Middle East had seen. For 3 days, he did not speak of ceasefires or borders. He told stories. Stories of his childhood, of villages scarred by terrorism, of mothers who wept until their eyes ran dry. He spoke of fathers who dug shallow graves for children, of blood that stained the dust red. And then he said, "This pain has no passport. A Palestinian mother's tears taste the same as an Israeli mother's tears. Your children's blood is the same red as Burkinabe blood." The room fell silent. For the first time in years, the delegation stopped speaking through prepared statements and started listening with their hearts. From the 4th to the 7th day, he forced them into joint sessions. No shouting, no interruptions, just listening. Israelis recounting nights under rocket fire, Palestinians recalling checkpoints and demolished homes. Each word was carried across the room like a wound laid bare. From the 8th to the 12th day, he shifted the ground. Not history, not ideology, but humanity. They spoke of food shortages, of hospitals running out of medicine, of children growing up with no schools to attend. Humanitarian needs became the language that both sides could understand. And then, on the 13th through 15th days, he moved to action. They drafted terms: a 14-day ceasefire, humanitarian corridors overseen by African Union peacekeepers, prisoner exchanges supervised by neutral African mediators, and international guarantees not from the usual Western powers, but from Russia, China, and the African Union. The final night, exhaustion and hope mingled in the room. Some wept quietly, others stared at the floor. But when the pens touched the paper, history was rewritten. On the 15th of June 2025, the Amman Accords were signed. Reporters rushed to declare it a miracle, the longest ceasefire in over a decade, brokered not by empires but by a soldier from Africa. Palestinians in Gaza cheered. Israelis in Tel Aviv dared for the first time in years to exhale without fear. In Ouagadougou, crowds poured into the streets chanting, "Africa the Peacemaker," but not everyone celebrated. Western capitals reacted with unease. In Washington, officials quietly questioned whether Traoré was being used as a proxy for rival powers. In Paris, media outlets mocked the talks as temporary theater. In London, politicians raised questions about the legitimacy of a military leader mediating global conflicts. Yet in Africa, it was different. In South Africa, elders remembered Mandela. In Ghana, they whispered of Nkrumah's dream. In Senegal, they spoke of Senghor's vision of African dignity. Across the continent, hope flared, and in Amman, one Palestinian delegate, moved to tears, said, "For the first time in years, someone understood our pain without taking sides." An Israeli representative echoed, "He knew our fears because he had lived them himself." The miracle of Amman was not written in treaties alone. It was written in the breaking of walls, in the recognition of shared humanity, in the courage of a young African leader who dared to speak truth into the world's oldest wounds. But brothers and sisters, miracles do not go unchallenged. Even as celebrations rang out, shadows were gathering. In hidden rooms, Western intelligence drew up plans. Budgets were signed, disinformation campaigns prepared, and assassins marked their maps. Because to some, peace is not profit, and to them, the rise of Africa as peacemaker was a threat too great to tolerate. The ink on the Amman Accords was barely dry when the whispers began. Not in Gaza, not in Tel Aviv, but in Washington, Paris, and London. In the corridors of Western power, Africa's triumph was not seen as a miracle. It was seen as a threat. Leaked documents later revealed what was already in motion: code names, budgets, and covert plans. The CIA funneled $23 million into disinformation campaigns, painting Captain Traoré as an Iranian puppet. Paris directed 18 million euros to pressure Francophone Africa, portraying him as reckless and illegitimate. London's intelligence set aside £12 million to probe his finances and undermine his credibility on the world stage. It was a machine of sabotage, media manipulation, diplomatic pressure, economic threats. And when words failed, bullets followed. On the 25th of June, 2025, a convoy rolled through Tel Aviv. At its center, the young African president who had dared to humble empires. Hidden on rooftops, snipers lay in wait. Precision rifles, traced later to Western suppliers, glinted under the sun. In seconds, silence broke into chaos. Shots cracked the air. Glass shattered. Screams echoed. Lieutenant Kabor, the trusted aide who had walked beside Traoré from battlefield to palace, fell first. A bullet tore through his chest. Another ripped into Traoré's shoulder, spinning him with the force of death itself. Blood stained his uniform, dripping down the man who had become the vessel of African hope. Panic surged. Security scrambled. The convoy swerved. Forensic analysis would later prove what everyone already suspected. This was no random attack. This was a professional hit, designed with precision, orchestrated with access to inside information only powerful agencies could possess. But the shot meant to silence him did the opposite. Wounded, grieving, Captain Traoré stood before cameras with his arm bound in bandages. His voice did not tremble. It thundered, "They killed my friend to stop peace, but his blood will not be wasted. The ceasefire will hold." Those words ignited something no bullet could kill. In Gaza, Palestinian families lit candles for Kabore. In Tel Aviv, Israelis condemned the violence against a man who had given them their first taste of calm in a decade. Across Africa, crowds surged into streets, chanting his name, raising both the Palestinian and Israeli flags alongside the colors of Burkina Faso. The assassination attempt backfired. The world saw not a pawn, not a puppet, but a peacemaker willing to bleed for what he believed. Russia and China pledged enhanced security for African mediators. The African Union convened an emergency session declaring support for his mission and vowing to protect it. In Ouagadougou, his name became sacred. Mothers told their children of the man who carried both wounds and wisdom. Elders spoke of him as Africa's Mandela reborn. And youth across the continent declared, if they fear him enough to shoot him, then he must be carrying Africa's power. The ceasefire, instead of collapsing, grew stronger. By mid-July, it had been extended from 14 days to 30, and then indefinitely. The more they tried to silence Africa, the louder Africa's voice became. And when Traoré finally returned home scarred but unbroken, the streets of Ouagadougou became a sea of humanity. 2.3 million people flooded the capital. They waved Palestinian flags, Israeli flags, and African banners. They cried, they sang, they chanted one name, the man who survived bullets, the man who buried his aide but refused to bury the dream, the man who carried Africa's hope in a blood-soaked uniform. Brothers and sisters, that day proved one truth. You can kill a man, but you cannot kill a movement. Yet even as Africa celebrated, the world's old powers tightened their grip. Because if Africa could bring peace to Israel and Palestine, what else could it do? What other fires could it extinguish? And who would lose power if Africa's wisdom became the new foundation of global diplomacy? The world could not look away. For 4 months, guns that had thundered across Gaza and the West Bank fell silent. Where drones once darkened skies, aid convoys now rolled. Where funerals had become routine, schools began to rise from rubble. And the name on every tongue was not Washington, not Brussels, but Traoré. In the United States, the reaction was split like a nation staring at its own reflection. Some lawmakers called him reckless, a soldier meddling in matters too complex for a small African state. Think tank analysts warned that Africa was stepping beyond its place. Yet others, pastors in southern churches, activists in northern cities, elders who remembered Martin Luther King, saw him as a living echo of their own struggle. On television, one commentator whispered, "This man carries the spirit of Mandela, and it terrifies the West." In Europe, unease spread like cracks in old stone. Paris scrambled to protect its fading influence in Africa. London's parliament questioned whether an African soldier could hold legitimacy in global affairs. Brussels, caught between skepticism and awe, admitted quietly, "Africa has achieved what we could not." But in the East, the tone was different. Moscow embraced him, offering security and diplomatic weight. Beijing pledged funding for African peace infrastructure, branding it the dawn of a new multipolar order. Even Tehran and Ankara, so often marginalized, praised Africa as the mediator the world had ignored too long. And then came voices not of politics, but of conscience. The Secretary General of the United Nations stood before cameras and said, "This is a new chapter in diplomacy. Africa has shown us what it means to lead with humanity." Pope Francis invited Traoré for a private audience, blessing his mission as one rooted in moral authority. Scholars convened conferences in Geneva and Cape Town, studying the Traoré method, a blend of Ubuntu philosophy, storytelling, and collective healing. For once, Africa was not in the footnotes of international relations. Africa was the headline. And brothers and sisters, that frightened the guardians of the old order. Because if Africa could silence the guns of Israel and Palestine, then who would listen to Washington's sermons of peace? If Africa could teach the world healing, who would need Europe's broken lessons of empire? The question hung heavy over every capital. Was this the beginning of an African century? Or would the world once again try to silence the song before it rose too high? By September 2025, the guns were still silent. 4 months of peace had held in a land where ceasefires usually collapsed within weeks. For Israel and Palestine, it was the longest breath of calm in more than a decade. For Africa, it was vindication. For the world, it was a revelation. Humanitarian corridors remained open, guarded not by NATO, not by UN blue helmets, but by African Union peacekeepers wearing the colors of a continent once dismissed as powerless. Aid convoys rolled through Gaza unimpeded. Medical evacuations were carried out under African supervision. Schools rose again with African engineers guiding the bricks. Even Israeli and Palestinian farmers began tentative cooperation projects, sowing seeds not just in soil, but in hope. And everywhere the question grew louder. If Africa could bring peace here, where else might its wisdom be needed? Soon requests poured in. From Kiev and Moscow came whispers of a new kind of mediator, one not chained to old blocks. Ethiopia and Eritrea asked whether Traoré could help resolve their border tensions. Mali and Algeria, long caught in disputes, looked toward Ouagadougou. Even Sudan and Chad, weary from conflict, turned their eyes to Africa's rising voice. In Ouagadougou, the dream became institution. The African Peace Institute was born, a place to train mediators, to study the continent's ancestral methods of conflict resolution, to document successes, to build a library of African diplomacy. From Ubuntu philosophy to the palaver tradition, from communal healing rituals to storytelling circles, the wisdom of centuries was gathered and offered to the world. Scholars called it the African diplomatic renaissance. Ordinary people called it common sense. Because what Traoré had shown was simple yet radical. Peace does not begin with borders or treaties, but with wounds acknowledged, with humanity restored, with enemies daring to see each other as neighbors once again. Across Africa, leaders seized the momentum. Nigeria launched a West African mediation initiative. South Africa expanded its Southern African peace programs. Egypt positioned itself as a partner for North African diplomacy. Kenya established an East African Conflict Resolution Center. Suddenly, a continent once treated as a stage for others' wars was writing its own script of peace. But brothers and sisters, this was about more than geopolitics. For the diaspora, for Black communities in America, in Europe, in the Caribbean, this moment carried the weight of centuries. Elders who had marched for civil rights in Selma and Montgomery now saw Africa not as the land of chains, but as the land of solutions. They said, the same spirit that lifted Dr. King, the same fire that guided Malcolm X, the same courage that sustained Mandela, it burns now in this generation of African leadership. And so the streets of Ouagadougou were not just filled with Burkinabe voices, but with a chorus from across the diaspora. Songs of pride, tears of recognition, chants of Africa the Peacemaker echoed from Harlem to Lagos, from Kingston to Johannesburg. Still, the shadow of resistance lingered. Western powers recalibrated, not with applause, but with strategy. America increased its budgets for African diplomacy, desperate to remain relevant. France, long clinging to its colonial ties, suddenly offered partnership. Britain spoke of coordination, Germany of training programs. Their tone softened, but beneath the smiles lay the same fear. A rising Africa could mean a declining West. Meanwhile, Russia and China deepened their embrace. Moscow promised security for African mediators. Beijing pledged billions to build Africa's peace infrastructure. Other nations once sidelined, Iran, Turkey, Brazil, all leaned in, recognizing that the center of gravity was shifting. And through it all stood Traoré, scarred but unbroken, carrying the blood of Traoré on his shoulder and the hopes of a continent in his voice. He had proven that Africa's wisdom was not folklore but strategy, that Africa's pain was not weakness but power, that Africa's time was not in the future but now. Yet the question remains, brothers and sisters, will the world let Africa lead? Or will they once again try to silence the drumbeat of a people rising? Because if the peace of Israel and Palestine could be birthed in Amman through the voice of a Burkina soldier, then perhaps the world has no excuse left. Perhaps the future belongs not to empires, not to old orders, but to a continent that has carried suffering long enough and now offers healing. And so, the story of 4 months of peace becomes more than history. It becomes prophecy. It becomes a call. It becomes the reminder that Africa is not a bystander in the theater of nations. Africa is the stage. Africa is the script. Africa is the peacemaker. They tried to kill the dream. They tried to silence the voice. They took the life of Kabore. They wounded the body of Traoré, but they could not break the movement. Instead, the blood spilled became the seed of something greater. For 4 months, in a land where rockets and bombs had become routine, silence reigned. In the streets of Gaza, in the neighborhoods of Tel Aviv, children walked to school without fear. Families broke bread without dread. The impossible became real, and it did not come from Washington or Paris. It came from Africa. It came from a young soldier who carried his people's scars as his credentials. Brothers and sisters, we must remember, this is not just the story of Traoré. This is the story of us, of Africa rising, of the diaspora remembering that our wisdom, our suffering, our resilience are not weaknesses, but weapons of peace. For centuries, the world said Africa was the problem. But in the ceasefire of Israel and Palestine, the world saw Africa as the solution. And yet, the struggle is not over. Empires still plot. Old powers still whisper. Their fear of an African century is real. But so too is our hope. Because every time they doubt, every time they sabotage, every time they fire their bullets, the movement grows stronger. So I ask you, not as viewers, but as witnesses, do you believe Africa deserves to lead? Do you believe the wisdom of our ancestors can heal the wounds of the world? Then lift your voice. Write in the comments, Africa the Peacemaker. Share this story so that others may see what was once hidden. And above all, hit that subscribe button and join African Life TV, because together we are not just watching history, we are shaping it. The world is watching. The powers are trembling. The future is African. And the name that will not be forgotten is this: Captain Traoré, the soldier who turned wounds into wisdom and proved that even the hardest stones of conflict can break before the river of peace.